and welcome back to Mariana Mas Books. My name is Mariana and today I am here with my first ever wrap-up. So, wish me luck. I am not going to do wrap-ups every month, but this month I participated in several readathons, which I wanted to share with you guys. I participated in Book Buffet, History Challenge, Reading Women Challenge, which is my year-long readathon, and the Invisible Cities project, which I am not participating in every month, but this month I did participate. My approach to readathons is fairly chill. I usually just take the theme of the readathon and then read books around that theme. There are only very few readathons for which I actually try to meet every single prompt. This year for me those are Reading Women Challenge, in September, Shorty September, as you saw my TBR, just because the prompts were really cool and I wanted to try to hit all of them, and Nonfiction November, just because that one is my personal favorite. This is because one of my favorite things about reading, one of my favorite parts of reading is the research prior to the reading. I love researching books. I love having prompts and doing the research to meet those prompts. That is why I am obsessed and addicted to readathons, because I love having to do the research and find the books that meet specific prompts. The other day I was watching a video that was sponsored by the Book of the Month Club, Book of the Month box, and they said a phrase that I assume is the Book of the Month slogan, that was that they choose the books for you so that you can spend more time reading and less time researching. And I guess that's their sales pitch, but I was like, but I love researching. Why would I want to have someone take that away from me? And also, I pride myself on being able to double and triple and quadruple on prompts and double up between challenges and reading one single book for tons of challenges. So that's what I did this month. I participated in 4 readathons and I read 8 books. And 2 of those books were not for any readathon. So you can do the math. Anyway, after that long intro, let's get on with the books. The first book I finished in the month of August was Can You Forgive Her by Anthony Trollope. This book I read for the Past It Classics book club, and I will link all the information of the book club down below. And this one I really liked, but I was very torn as to how to rate it. I think I ended up giving it 3 stars, but I was between 3, 3.5, 4, because it really is very well written. I do want to read more by Anthony Trollope. I have never read him before. I find first that he is a very funny writer. He is hilarious to the point of laugh out loud funny. He is a very smart writer. His satire game is on point. I gave it 3 stars mainly because of something that came up during the discussion in the Past It Classics live show, which was someone that said, how can this book be feminist and sexist at the same time? And I felt that to be true. There were certain times where I just thought, wow, Anthony Trollope is such a feminist, and then there were times where I was like, is he though? There's this episode of Friends where Ross is going out with 2 different women and he's trying to choose which one to keep going out with, and he's describing one of them and he says, she told this joke the other day, which if it was a joke then she's very funny, but if it wasn't then she's a little bit racist. And that's how I felt about Anthony Trollope, because he does so much satire and he writes such funny funny lines, and then there were these parts where you're like, wow, if that was a joke, then it was extremely funny, but if it wasn't, then he's a bit of a misogynist, or he's a bit sexist. So yeah, that's the reason I gave it 3 stars, because the parts where I wasn't sure made me a bit of uncomfortable, but all the other parts I thought were genius. The next book I finished was the poetry collection We Are Not Your Metaphor. So is We Are Not Your Metaphor, a disability poetry anthology, which is edited by the Zoeglossia Fellows. Zoeglossia is an organization that strives to create more inclusive spaces for poets with disabilities. I spoke more about the collection and about Zoeglossia in my one of my Poetry Thursday videos, so I'm going to link it if you want to see it. I gave this one 5 stars. I highly recommend it if you like contemporary poetry. If you don't, this anthology is not for you. Some poems are very experimental and very much contemporary, so if you don't enjoy that in poetry, then this is not for you. But if you do like contemporary poetry, then highly recommend it. The next book I finished was How to Behave Badly in Renaissance Britain by Ruth Goodman, which I read in audiobook narrated by the author. This one, I think in the US, is called How to Behave Badly in Elizabethan England, or Elizabethan Britain, I'm not sure, but yeah, it has a different name in the US. But I read it in this version in audiobook narrated, as I said, by the author. This narration was genius. If you're going to read this book, then you have to do it on audiobook. The book, as it says, is How to Behave Badly. So it's a non-fiction book about the things that were considered bad behavior in Renaissance Britain. It's very interesting because Ruth Goodman, the historian that writes this book, in her introduction, she explains the importance of the people who misbehave for historians, because one thing she says is, if you behave correctly, then no one writes about you. So we don't have records of the people that behave correctly because they weren't interesting for people, it was just like, yeah, every day. But the people who misbehaved, those are the people that get talked about and written about. So that's how you can learn history. It was very interesting in that sense. The book itself, I gave 3 stars, just because there were certain parts where it got a bit too technical. So for example, there are certain chapters where she will talk about bowing and the correct posture when you bow, and she will go in extreme detail too. You have to move your right foot 45 degrees away from your body, and then step your left foot approximately X number of inches, and then your body, you have to bow in certain angle, and then lift your head in another angle, and she goes into extreme detail, which is why I think that if you're going to read this audiobook, is better, because Ruth Goodman is an excellent narrator. She is so funny, and she brings the book to life. So I feel like if I had been reading that book in paper or in digital form, I would have skimmed through all those detailed parts of bowing and such. But because I was listening in audiobook, and she's very funny, she gives it a very lively description. Then it made it more entertaining. So if you are interested in the book, then go ahead and read it in audiobook. But just knowing that it's a very entertaining read, and it's a light historical reading. You are not going to get a very dense, super transcendental study of history. It's very interesting, very entertaining, good, light, historical non-fiction read. Oh, and I read this one for the history challenge. The next book that I finished was The Taste of Longing, Ethel Mulvaney and Her Starving Prisoners of War Cookbook. This was another non-fiction read that I read for the Book Buffet and History Challenge. And also the Reading Women Challenge for the prompt, a book about incarceration. This book is a non-history. It's a non-fiction account of the life of Ethel Mulvaney, who was a Canadian Red Cross volunteer who was incarcerated in Singapore during World War II. She was incarcerated in Changi prison with other prisoners of war, and it follows her life. It follows her time during prison, and it follows the story of a cookbook she wrote with recipes from her and fellow prisoners of war. They had this game where they talked about all the food that they were dreaming about eating, because they were being starved in prison. There are very graphic descriptions of starvation and hunger, and how at one point Ethel Mulvaney tries to chew the spine of her Bible to see if she can get some protein from the glue of the binding of the Bible. So that level of starvation. So what they did is that they created this game, this make-believe game, where they imagined all the feasts and the banquets that they would like to eat, and they shared the recipes for those foods. It tells about how it helped them, this make-believe, to make them feel more hopeful. And after they were liberated, Ethel Mulvaney took it upon herself to gather all the recipes and publish the cookbook with all the recipes from the prisoners of war. There's this section where the author talks about play in adults and in children during these times of imprisonment, and how adults use play to escape reality and children use play to process their reality. So while adults play these games of make-believe where they try to imagine if they were out of prison, the children played games of war. I'm going to share with you one quote that I feel really explains and gives you a better picture of both the story and the message that this book is trying to convey. Okay, so I'm going to share two quotes with you. The first one says, "Those who were moved to rely on the delight of fiction as well as the science of nutrition to survive gathered in small groups with Ethel and her companions around an empty space in a bare yard to talk about foods they had no hope of tasting. The conversations always began with the question, 'What would you serve?' Meaning, what would you serve if you had like a dinner party? What would you serve? And the ideas flowed from there." So this gives you like a good summary of this game that I told you about, this make-believe that they used to survive inside prison. And then this quote, "Death was so closely linked with a lack of food that Ethel believed even an imaginary feast was medicinal. To that end, she was convinced that recipe writing should be indulged any time the pain of hunger became acute. Even when hunger went beyond pain, Ethel was sure that culinary dreams could galvanize people by presenting them with a table in the skies." And this last thing, the table in the skies, is referencing a poem that she used to recite to herself during her imprisonment. The next book that I finished was a graphic non-fiction book, Banned Book Club, which was written by Kim Hyun-Suk and Ryan Estrada, and the art was done by Hyun-Ju. And this one I read for Invisible Cities Project. One of the countries that you had to read for August was South Korea, and this is written by and illustrated by South Korean female authors, and it is a non-fiction account of the 80s, specifically the 80s in South Korea. It follows a group of students that are part of protests in school against the government and the censorship that they went through, and this is why it's called Banned Book Club, because they had a book club of all the banned books that they weren't supposed to be reading. This was good, but it wasn't great, and to be fair, I think this is because it was intended to be a young adult graphic non-fiction, so I would describe it as cute, which is not a description you would use in a book that has graphic scenes of torture by police. It didn't really go into detail, and it was much more of a hopeful story. So it was very much like, this is the history and this is the message and this is what you have to learn, and in the end when you speak up, like that kind of thing, which is good, but it was very clearly a young adult, and I feel a young adult book. So if you want to learn a little bit about history, then this is good, but if you want a very in-depth and adult view of what happened, then this is not it. What I do want to say is that it was my first non-fiction graphic book. I was always interested in graphic novels and comics, and I could never get into them. And I saw a video that Jen from Remembered Reads created on how to read comics, which was tremendously helpful, and it allowed me to read comics and graphic pieces of fiction and non-fiction. So I won't get into detail. Maybe I'll do a video on how I am doing that now, but I just wanted to shout out Jen because she really helped me to read graphic pieces of fiction and non-fiction. But yeah, it was good, 3 stars, not life-changing. Then I read the memoir Longthroat Memoirs, Soups, Sex and Nigerian Taste Buds by Yemisi Aribisala. This one I read for Book Buffet, for Reading Women Challenge, for the prompt A Cookbook by a Woman of Color, and for Invisible Cities. The other country was Nigeria, and Yemisi Aribisala is a Nigerian author. So this book is all about Nigerian food, which is a type of food I had never read about and I honestly didn't know a lot about. In that sense it was very good, and but also in the sense that it's very funny. This is a collection of essays. It's not clear to me if it is a collection of essays or a collection of blog posts, because Yemisi Aribisala did write a food blog on Nigerian food. I'm not sure if they are essays she wrote specifically for this book or if they are blog posts from that blog. Either way, I really like this book. Yemisi Aribisala's writing is very honest, very funny, and very unapologetic. It was interesting to learn about Nigerian food, about Nigerian culture. As I said, she is Nigerian and she lives in Nigeria. So you get a very authentic view on the culture, on the food, on the traditions, on everything. And as I said, she's very funny, she's very unapologetically truthful, she's very honest, and she just says things as she thinks them. And I thought it was very refreshing to read this type of book. It was surprisingly relatable for me, being that this book is from Nigeria, which is in Africa, which is very far and different from where I live and where I'm from, which is Mexico. But there were many things that were surprisingly relatable. There is this essay where she talks about how Nigerians, they have this history of taking food in the airport when they are traveling abroad because they can't find traditional foods in other countries. And that reminded me of really funny anecdotes I know of Mexican people taking food across the border. For example, this time my grandma was going to Italy to visit her brother who lives in Italy and hadn't been in Mexico for a long time. So she wanted to take him food from here because even if you can find Mexican food, you can't find Mexican food. So she wanted to take him several things. She took him several things, but one of those things that she took him were handmade tortillas. What she did was she took one of these round cookie tins or cookie cans, and she put the tortillas inside the cookie tin, and that she took in her suitcase, so it looked like she was taking a cookie tin, but it was in fact handmade tortillas. So stories like that. And Yemisi Aribisala has several anecdotes that were surprisingly relatable. And also, and this is something that I did want to talk about, as I said, she is Nigerian and she lives in Nigeria. So what she writes is very authentic. However, I did wonder about how much of what she writes is common or mainstream and how much is much more traditional and only practiced by maybe older women or older generations. And this is because one thing that she talks about, and that is also relatable to me, is racial stereotypes, and how when she goes abroad people assume certain things because she is Nigerian, and they assume certain things about Nigeria and Nigerian people, or rather African people, because that's something she talks about, how Africa is mentioned as if it was a country when it's a continent with many countries. So that's one thing, but she does talk a lot about that. And then there's this quote where she mentions how when she studied in Wales, people assumed, and she puts it this way, people assumed their food went straight from the floor to their plate, meaning like it's alive. And that reminded me of when I spent a year abroad in the US, and one of my friends was talking about coming to visit me in Mexico when I came back, but she told me she would come under the condition that she wouldn't eat anything alive. Which we don't eat things that are alive. I don't know where she got that idea, but when you are from Mexico and you go to the US, people ask you the craziest things, and they assume the craziest things about Mexico, and some things are things that are true, but they are true in rural areas, or they are true in older generations, traditions that are no longer kept. Even, for example, Dia de Muertos, which is like very big in the US for some reason. Here it's, I have never in my life created an altar for Dia de Muertos, right? But my grandmother does. So that type of thing where certain traditional aspects are no longer kept, and whether they should be or shouldn't be, that's a whole other conversation. But just in the sense of the ideas that are portrayed to the foreigners or to people abroad about a certain country, the stereotypes that are created from traditional cliches from maybe from the past or from certain areas of the country. So in that sense, it made me wonder about some things that when she talked about them, some traditional things, some beliefs about food, about culture, where I would read them and wonder how much is that mainstream and how much it's more in very traditional spaces and maybe older generations. If you see, or if I see even the food documentary done by a Mexican chef who lives in Mexico and talking about traditional Mexican food, it is very likely that they are going to go visit rural areas and traditional places where they prepare the food as if it was prepared traditionally. So yeah, it made me wonder about, because I don't want to come out of this book with stereotypes or with ideas that are wrong about Nigeria and about Nigerian people, even if I am reading a Nigerian. And well, finally for this book, I do want to share a quote. I really like sharing quotes because I feel like you get the idea of the writing style and the theme and the tone you're going to get in a book. So I really enjoy sharing quotes. I'm sorry if this makes the wrap up even longer. These are several quotes that I pieced together from one single essay, from the essay A Bowl of Aloof Nigerian Soup. And the reason why I chose these quotes are to show this unapologetic honesty, to show her sense of humor, and to show her description of Nigerian food, which is very beautiful. You are not getting everything. Like, if you like this, you can read the whole book, but it gives you a small taste, pun intended. Okay, so it says, okay, this is referencing a cookbook that she has by Indian Welsh chef Barry. Oh god, I don't have. Okay, his last name is Barry, and his cookbook is called Exotic Food the Easy Way or something like that. So she's referencing that cookbook, and she says, Barry's Nigerian River Province chicken soup is the second attempt at a Nigerian food in his book. The recipe is so fascinatingly confused in its interpretation that it makes me wonder if Nigerian recipes are inaccessible to the outsider and have been so for a long, long time, or if outsiders generally believe that our food is unsophisticated, without a concrete identity, and can just be made up as one gets along. Nigerian River Province chicken soup is, I assume, cooked in the Nigerian River Province, wherever that is. That made me laugh. The fundamental burning question becomes, what is Nigerian soup? Or, for the long-suffering Nigerian whose culinary culture has been forever grossly misunderstood and really knows only one soup, what is soup? Nigerian soup is like the Yoruba language. Yemisi Aribisala's family is from the Yoruba culture. So Nigerian soup is like the Yoruba language, more sophisticated than English, which is the child of rape of Frenchmen and Germans, and superior to French, which is by far superior to English. Nigerian soup does not have even a contemporary in French cooking. It is a global individual. It has a face, a look. It has a fundamental flowing premise, like blood running through its veins. Palm oil. The next book I read is called Una mujer en el arte mexicano, Memorias de Inés Amor, by Jorge, Alberto, Manrique, and Teresa del Conde. This one is out of print and it is not translated, so I'm going to roughly translate the title. It would be something like A Woman in Mexican Art, Memories of Inés Amor, by Jorge, Alberto, Manrique, and Teresa del Conde, who are two Mexican historians. As the name suggests, it is a collection of memories of Inés Amor, who ran the first art gallery dedicated exclusively to Mexican art in Mexico, which was opened in 1935, I believe. This book was published in 1985, and it is a collection of memories, as I said, that were told by Inés Amor to these two historians in 1975. What do I mean by a collection of memories? Literally, it is just that. Here in Mexico, and in general I feel like in Latin America, we have a genre of book called Memorias, which, because the name is very similar to memoir, it might be more commonly translated as memoir, but Memorias is not at all the same as memoir. And something I realized while reading this book is that we don't have memoirs as such. We either have Memorias, which are collections of memories, or we have autobiography. This form and structure of memoir, as you know it in English, is not at all common here in Latin America. That being said, Inés Amor approached the main historian who writes the book to tell him that she wanted to publish her memories, her memorias, of the times of the gallery, of the art gallery, because since it was the first art gallery in Mexico dedicated to Mexican art, and it was created right after the revolution, so it's so very interesting historical times in Mexican history, she thought that it would be valuable to record the memories of the times at the gallery. However, she didn't have time to write them, so she wanted to tell her memories to this historian and have him write her memories and then publish them. He called a colleague of his, so he co-wrote it with Teresa del Conde. And what they did was that weekly, for a year, they went to Inés Amor's house, and she would tell them her memories about the gallery, and then they just transcribed them and published them. They didn't alter her memories to give them a literary format. They just slightly corrected maybe style, grammar. They gave it a certain structure, because they said maybe Inés Amor would repeat a certain anecdote, so they won't repeat it in the book. So what they did was just give it structure and give it grammar and punctuation, because when you talk you don't have that. But other than that, it's just as she told it to them. So when you're reading the book, it feels as if Inés Amor is telling you her memories, and it is fabulous because she was friends with Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo and Siqueiros and Orozco and all of the Mexican great artists. You find out about anecdotes and stories that you won't find out about in art books or art history books. Everyday type of anecdotes, like when a president came to a gallery and Frida Kahlo was making jokes at his expense, or a very famous artist who used his paintings at his house to cover the chill from the windows, like that type of anecdotes that you won't find out anywhere else. I joked about this on Twitter the other day. I said Inés Amor was spilling the tea before spilling the tea was a thing, because she will just tell you everything. It feels like reading kind of like a gossipy account of a very interesting period in Mexican art history. This book I read for the History Challenge. I've had it in my shelves for a long time. It is, as I said, out of print, and my copy is a used copy from the original 1985. I gave this one 4.5 stars just because certain parts felt a little bit longer, but by a very slim margin. It was almost 5 stars. I love this book. It was fabulous, it was funny, it was interesting, and I loved it. And finally, the final book I read was another audiobook called The Ship of Dreams, The Sinking of the Titanic, and the End of the Edwardian Era by Russell Gareth, narrated by Jenny Funnell. This book was so good, I gave this one 5 stars. If you are looking for a book on the Titanic and you just want that, I wouldn't recommend this book, because as the title suggests, it is the sinking of the Titanic and the end of the Edwardian era. I would say that 50% of the book is dedicated to the Titanic, the sinking, the survivors, etc. And the first 50% is dedicated to situating the Titanic's sinking in the historical and cultural and economic context and period, which is why I loved it. It was so interesting to hear about the time period in which the Titanic was constructed, which was this very interesting time period where the monarchies and the nobility class are kind of like going down, and the parliament and democracies and working class are going up. And it's this era in which the UK is slightly going lowering in world importance. I don't know how to say it. I have my word the word in Spanish in my mind, but not in English. And the US is rising up to be like the world power. And then he uses the Titanic to exemplify and to illustrate the time period. So for example, he will explain how most of the passengers in first class were not noble British people, but rather American millionaires. In a way, the Titanic becomes this symbol or this metaphor of the UK passing the torch along to the US. There's this quote, he says, like, the Titanic was a perfect blend of British sensibilities and American money. And I feel like that sums up the time period, the economic struggles of the time. It's very interesting to hear all about the shipyards and the strikes, the working class rising up. It's also very interesting to hear about the Titanic. So those two things combined, I thought made an excellent read. All in all, it was a very interesting read. I would definitely recommend this one. I gave it 5 stars, and I read this one for the history challenge. So, I have been talking, I think, for an hour. This is going to be so hard to edit. Wrap-ups are hard, guys. I have so much respect for all of you for doing monthly wrap-ups. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed the wrap-up. Anything I mentioned will be, of course, linked in the description box. And I will see you next Thursday with a Poetry Thursday this time. And in the meantime, happy reading.